So you decided that this was the year that you were going to launch your podcast. You bought a microphone and you even recorded a few episodes that are sitting in your computer. But what about an intro? What about an outro? How do you edit those episodes? How do you get your podcast out there so people can start listening to it? Well, guess what? In this video, I am going to cover everything you need to know step by step to launch your podcast this year and get it out to people. After watching this video, you're going to know exactly what to do to get launched step by step. Let's dive right in. If you are new to the channel, my name is Oumar and I've been podcasting since 2016 and I've helped many entrepreneurs and small business owners just like you start their podcasts. Starting a podcast can be extremely overwhelming due to the fact that there is so much information out there, so many tools and so much information that it's difficult to figure out what to do, where to start, and in what order you should do it. Most people think about starting a podcast for months. The good news is that podcasting has actually gotten simpler and it's a lot easier to get started. And in this video, I'm going to show you exactly what to do step by step so you can go from idea to launch in a matter of weeks or even days rather than months. Let's dive right in. Podcasting hasn't gotten harder. It just got a lot noisier. Everywhere you turn, there's someone telling you how to do it and what you need. Now, the good news is I use a very simple framework that will help you launch your podcast in a matter of days or weeks instead of months or years. This framework consists of three things. The first one is launch first, improve later. The second one is clarity beats complexity any day of the week. And the third one is momentum over motivation. What do I mean by that? Let's dive into those three things briefly. Let's talk about the first one, which is launch first, improve later. You don't need to do everything under the sun. You need to do the right things to get you started. You can always improve your podcast later. When I was working in IT, there's something that I learned called the concept of minimum viable product, MVP, right? The concept is that if you want to do a project that's very, very complicated, in fact, what you really need to do is focus on the minimum necessary items or things that you need to do to get you going. And you can always iterate, meaning you can always repeat the steps and go through what you already did and make it better. When you take that approach, you can launch a lot faster than trying to get everything to be perfect. And the second concept is clarity beats complexity any day of the week. Now, what that means is that you don't need to follow every single advice and you don't need to do everything that you hear to launch your podcast. Instead, you actually need to be very clear on the steps you need to take to launch your podcast. And if you try to do too many things and do everything that you hear, every advice that you see or hear, you are not going to get anywhere. And we are going to dig deeper into what it is that you need to do to get you launched. And the third concept is momentum beats motivation. So think about it. You probably feel motivated at times and you want to launch your podcast, and that fades away very quickly when you realize that there is so much that you have to do, or at least that's what the gurus tell you. And then you look at the steps that you have to take and it's completely demoralizing, and then you stop, you don't make any progress. Let's dive into the steps you need to take to launch your podcast. The first one is to choose a topic that supports your business. Many people sometimes when asked will say, well, I want to start a podcast, just for the fun of it, right? So that's not what you want to do. If you want to start a podcast that actually supports or complements your business, you need to make sure that the topic you choose does exactly that. Now, why is this important? Well, if you have a business and you want to launch a podcast where you're just doing it for fun, well, it doesn't really support your business and it doesn't present you in the best light. A podcast, when done right, can actually be one of the best things that you can do for your business. It can be a trust builder. It can present you as someone with knowledge and authority and expertise in the field in which you are helping people. And it also presents you as a serious business owner, because not only do you know what you're talking about, but you are actively sharing knowledge and information and showing people how to solve the problems that your business solves for them. So here are 3 questions that you can ask to help you decide on what you want to talk about on your podcast in a way that it will support your business. So the first question is, what role do you want your podcast to play for your listeners and for your business specifically? And the second question you should ask yourself is, what specifically are you going to talk about in your podcast? And we will dig deeper into topic selection. Now, the third question is also as important as the first 2 questions is, what do listeners need from you to be able to make progress? What is the transformation that they will get when they listen to your podcast? So what do they need from you? What advice, what information can you give them for them to move from where they are today with a problem to even making a small step forward to solving that problem? And another question you can ask yourself is, who am I trying to help with the podcast? So when you ask that question, it will force you to specifically think about the person that your podcast will actually help, and potentially the person that would actually be interested in what your business has to offer, services or products or whatever it is that you do or provide to help that particular customer. Another question is, what problems are they stuck on? Where in their lives are they? What problem do they have that your product or service or your business can help them overcome? And thirdly, why would they listen to you instead of reading a book or watching another video or a YouTube short, right? So think about what you bring to the table that will differentiate you from all of the other people online or all of the other competitors that they could go to. When you answer all those questions, you will have a clear idea of what it is that you should be talking about on your podcast that will actually complement and support your business. Now let's go on to step 2. Step 2 is make the only 3 decisions that will actually help you launch. And this step will help you remove the overwhelm and the confusion or the feeling of being stuck because you don't know where to start, you don't know where to go, and every time you watch another video, it just adds to the confusion. So the first one is the topic. What is your podcast about? And get very clear and very specific about what it is that your podcast is about, because this is important. You don't want to be vague. And the second one is, who is it for? Who is your listener? Who is going to listen to your podcast? And most importantly, why would they want to listen to the podcast? And number 3 is the format. So the format is, you can do a solo podcast, meaning you in front of the camera or the microphone talking, and there's no one else on the podcast. It's just you and the camera, just like what I'm doing right now. So that's one format. Number 2, you can do interviews. Interviews is you bringing in a guest on your podcast and interviewing that guest, asking them questions to share specific knowledge and expertise about your podcast topic, and you simply facilitate the conversation. And number 3 is the hybrid format. You can do solo episodes. So every once in a while, maybe you get in front of the microphone, in front of the camera, and talk about your business or a topic that relates to the problem that you solve on your podcast. That should also relate to your business. And occasionally, you also have some guests on the podcast. So this is the hybrid format, and it's one that I would recommend because it helps you not to have to come up with episodes on your own every single day. And if you have a guest on, they will bring the knowledge and the expertise, and that covers the content for the episode, rather than you having to do recordings on your own every single time. So those are the important things that you need to focus on that will actually move the needle to getting you one step closer to launching your podcast. Everything else is noise, and it just overcomplicates things. The gear, the music, the branding, how you set up your studio, all of that is just going to add complexity and will prevent you from starting your podcast. And most podcasters, particularly beginners, will just overthink this, overcomplicate this step, and they will be stalled for months. And one last thing I will say about this step is whatever you decide, whatever format you decide to do, is that it should support the podcast and be natural and allow you to be consistent rather than being complicated. If it's too difficult, if you're doing solo episodes, for example, is too much work and it demoralizes you and breaks your momentum, then switch to interviews. If interviews are not working for you, do a hybrid, right? So it's your podcast. You have the freedom of creating things, of how you want to run it. So don't feel like you have to be stuck in one single format. Now let's talk about step 3, which is the only equipment that you really need. First of all, I'm going to dispel a myth here. You don't need a studio to start a podcast. Most first-time podcasters do not need a studio. They think they need a studio because that's what they see online. That's what gurus tell them. They get stuck into sourcing lights and buying lights and setting up microphones and cloud lifters and audio interfaces, and they get lost into that complexity of equipment. What you really need is a good microphone. Generally, a USB microphone would do the trick. You need to be in a quiet room, and you need maybe a good set of headphones. That's it. In most cases, that's what you need. Unless you're podcasting in person, which 99% of people or new podcasters are doing, it's remotely, you don't need to have a studio. You don't need to complicate things. And I also want to caution you about mistakes that new podcasters make. And one of those mistakes is to buy expensive microphones, or again, spend the money to buy a studio, $800 microphones, or buying $1,500 cameras. All of that is just really, it's number one, it's hurting your pocketbook. And number two, it's adding complexity to your workflow, and it's just getting in the way of you actually starting your podcast. And another mistake that I see is that sometimes clients will come to me after they've already bought all of this gear and they don't know what to do with it. And in most cases, they end up not really needing all of that gear to actually launch their podcast. It is natural to want to start a video podcast because video is what most people see, and video is certainly big. But I'm here to tell you that if you want to start a podcast and you want to follow the MVP path, the minimum viable path, what I would recommend for you is to focus on starting an audio podcast first. Maybe the first 3 months, the first 6 months, until you get the hang of it. Then consider adding video, because audio is the shortest path to starting a podcast. And that's highly what I would recommend for you to do. And if you're wondering what equipment you need to use specifically in terms of the microphone or even a camera, there's a PDF that is going to be in the link in the description that you can download. It's a free PDF that will tell you exactly what you need to buy so you can actually go and start your podcast and not get stuck into the overcomplication that people tell you that you need to in terms of gear. Okay, so we talked about equipment. Now, step 4 is the simple recording workflow that you need to follow. So how do you record your podcast? How should it work and what should you do? Now, use a simple episode outline format. What do I mean by that? So you don't have to script everything and write it word for word. Most beginner podcasters think that you have to have everything outlined and written out like a speech and read it out loud. And what that leads to is that they start reading it and they realize that it's not natural. And then what do? They go on YouTube, they look at what they can do to actually be able to read a script. And no surprise, a guru will tell them you need to buy a teleprompter. And all of a sudden now you're going further away from launching your podcast because you need to buy a teleprompter, or you need to do this or that, and it's moving you away from starting your podcast. So what should you do instead? So what you should do is actually outline the things that you are going to talk about. You are a business owner. You are an entrepreneur. You know your topic very well. If you write 3 bullets or 5 bullets, each of the bullets you can riff on and talk about just based on your general knowledge and expertise for 5-7 minutes, right? Times 3, times 4 times 5, you have an episode. So you don't have to script everything. I'm sharing this information right now. I just have talking points in front of me, and I'm riffing out of that because I have the knowledge and experience to talk about these things. And you should do the same thing and look at releasing or recording your podcast the same way. And that's one less barrier than having to write everything down and trying to memorize a script. That just gets in the way, again, of you launching your podcast. Another advice I will give is that make sure that you record in one take. One take doesn't mean that you don't make mistakes. It just means don't stop recording. Instead of stopping and hitting stop and having to hit record again, just keep going. If you make a mistake, stop. Wait for 3 seconds and then continue, repeat what you have to say and keep going. If you do it that way, it will keep the momentum going. And particularly when you stop, if you make a mistake, don't go back to the beginning. Continue talking, pick up where you left off, where you made the mistake, and just keep going. That will get you quicker to finishing that first recording than having to stop and restart. And by the way, confidence for recording these episodes comes by doing the recording, not after. The more you do it, the more comfortable you become and the more confident you become in your ability to actually just talk about an episode and record that episode. And by the way, every single new podcaster ever hates the sound of their voice, including me. The first time I released my very first episode back in, I think it was 2015, when I did my first recording, I didn't like it, right? And over the years, I've seen a lot of people, many clients have to wanting to re-record everything they did, and I would prevent them from doing that. And I would tell them that, no, every single beginner podcaster doesn't like the sound of their voice or doesn't like what they look like on video. And that's completely normal. It's completely natural. We are our very own worst enemy. And anything that's worth doing is you will start to feel those, your imposter syndrome sabotaging you into not doing it. But you just have to understand that it's completely natural. It's completely normal. Just push through it, record it, don't second guess it. It's good enough, release it. Now let's talk about step 5, which is editing your podcast. One of the things that I want you to focus on when it comes to editing is edit for clarity rather than editing for perfection. I'm going to repeat this because this is really important. Edit for clarity rather than editing for perfection. Perfection is not attainable. So what you need to focus on instead is this episode clear enough and succinct enough that someone listening to it can go from point 1 to point B without being confused? Is what I'm saying making sense? Is it clear? That's what your editing should focus on. Instead, you shouldn't be aiming for perfection. So one thing that new podcasters or beginner podcasters will do is they will try to use tools out there and think that they have to remove every single mistake, every filler word, every 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 No, that's a natural part of speech. The only thing you should be focusing on removing is if you have long pauses, right? If you have a pause that exceeds 3 seconds or so, yes, sure, you can remove that, or maybe 5 seconds. And if you have repeated sentences throughout your podcast or right back to back, yes, it makes sense to cut that out and just focus on the part that very clearly conveys the message that you're trying to convey in your recording. And another thing that you should remove is if you make a major mistake or a stumble, or you say something that's completely off topic and is meandering into some other unrelated topic, yeah, sure, remove that. But really anything else you should leave in. It's very, very difficult as a first-time podcaster to resist the urge to over-edit, right? Don't over-edit, not to mention that that's going to take a lot more of your time than it should to actually get that episode finished. And if you shoot for perfection, you're never going to publish that episode, not only in recording and editing, but also we talked about this earlier, equipment. So focus on having a simple workflow rather than having a fancy workflow that's super complicated that aims for perfection. And in fact, one thing that I've seen is that Over-editing your podcast episode kills your momentum more than having a bad microphone or a bad video. If people are interested in what you have to say, they don't care for perfection. In fact, they want to see you make some mistakes and have some filler words and say some ums or ahs or hesitate or maybe repeat yourself a little bit. That's more natural. That shows that you are human and they are more likely rather to trust you rather than aiming for perfection and alienating people. Now we're on to step 6, which is hosting, publishing your podcast, and actually going live with your podcast so the world can finally listen to your podcast. Now, let's talk about hosting a little bit. So for your podcast to be available, after you record and edit your podcasts and you have episodes on your computer, you need a place to put those episodes. That's where hosting comes into play. You need to find a podcast host, to actually save or store the recorded podcast episodes. So when you get a host, you will essentially upload your episodes onto that host so they can actually store the episodes and give you a link, or rather, more specifically, a podcast feed that will allow you to submit that link, meaning the link to your podcast, to directories like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and the list goes on. But to get to that point, you need to get a host, someone who will actually hold that podcast, those podcast episodes. So directories like Amazon and Apple and Spotify have a place to go to get those episodes, and so that your listeners can stream those episodes. Now, when you go to those hosts, you will upload your episodes and then you will publish them, and your podcast will be available. Now, a little note here is that just because you published your podcast doesn't mean that you are promoting it. Publishing your podcast by using a host just allows for people to be able to now access your podcast episodes. It doesn't mean that it's promoting it. It just means that it's available. So there are certain things that you need to do, and we'll talk about that briefly, to actually get people to find and listen to your podcast. Sure, some people will naturally find your podcast organically the moment you submit it to those directories. Now, when you submit your podcast to these directories, Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, they have to approve you, and that takes a few days for them to actually approve your podcast once you are at that stage. So keep that in mind as you plan to launch your podcast, particularly if you're telling people that you're launching on a certain day or a certain week. So just keep that in mind, that it takes a few days to actually launch your podcast. Other than that, there isn't really anything special or unique to launch your podcast. And there are hosts that you can use, certainly, and I can recommend some. I'll put a link in the description for the top 3 hosts that I recommend that you use, that I use myself and my clients use, and they've been really good, really reliable, and they give you metrics and statistics so you know how well your podcast is doing. Link in the description for those hosts that I recommend for using to launch your podcast. Other than that, again, you don't need anything special. You don't need to have trailers. You don't need to have teasers. You don't need to make big announcements. Sure, you can't promote your podcast, but really, when we look at the minimum viable actions or products, going back to my example earlier, that's really the skeleton that you need to actually launch your podcast. You can always, again, improve, iterate, and do more. But the focus here is to get you to launch as quickly as possible, rather than sitting on this for months, if not years. Step 7, let's talk about launching your podcast without a large audience. So that's going to be most people. I would say about 99% of people will be in this situation where you don't have a large audience. Maybe you have a few thousand followers, maybe not, on social media. So what do you do when you need to launch, but you don't have a large audience? First of all, what I want you to realize is that small launches are normal. Now, there's an expectation there that you can start a podcast and launch, and then it's going to be huge, it's going to blow up, you're going to have millions of followers, and you're going to make a lot of money. That's not the reality for 99% of podcasters. The growth of new podcasts actually takes time, and that's by design. Podcasts build trust, they build followers, but it happens slowly. For most podcasts, that's how it happens. So your job as a new podcaster and as a podcast host is to focus on having conversations and releasing episodes consistently, helping people and giving them that transformation, if you will, which is something that will allow them to chip away at that problem, right? To solve a little bit at a time that problem. And that's really what you should focus on rather than trying to go viral or trying to blow up overnight. If you expect to launch a podcast and blow up overnight, I'm going to tell you right now, podcasting is not going to be for you. Podcasting takes time, it takes consistency, and perhaps the most important thing about looking at those three simple frameworks, steps that I mentioned in the framework earlier, is to be consistent, right? That's the next most important thing, which is release episodes consistently and be careful not to start weekly, because podcasting does take a lot of work, especially if you are going to do solo episodes instead of interviews. It takes time to coordinate all of that, to sit in front of a microphone and record. And if you're doing it weekly, you may not be giving yourself enough time between week 1 and week 2. There isn't enough time in the week for you, particularly if you're just a single individual, to actually plan, record, release, and promote a single episode. So be careful not to start weekly. I generally recommend that you start once a month if that works for you, twice a month if that's better, or maybe 3 times a month. But do not start podcasting weekly, because you are going to be burnt out and you are going to stop and you're not going to continue, which is a requirement. That consistency piece comes from being able to continue beyond the 3 months, beyond the 6 months. That's when you actually start seeing followers, loyal listeners who are going to start to share your podcast with others. So that's an important piece you should keep in mind. And you should always focus on your first listeners and give them the information. Keep nurturing them, keep giving them episodes, keep talking to them, even if it's a smaller audience. Now, people will tend to give up because they don't see an immediate growth, thinking, well, I'm only getting 100 listeners a week or 500 listeners a month, or whatever that number might be. Well, think of it this way. If you have a business and someone came to you and said, hey, would you like to come talk to 100 people in a conference room and talk about your topic or your business? Would you do it? Exactly. Most of us would, because even if one person or 2 people within that 100 people, 300 people, 500 people a month are interested in what you have to say, that's a big deal. You're still getting engagement. You're still talking to real human beings behind that microphone. And don't lose sight of that. That's really important. Your audience, your growth will come from you consistently releasing episodes and releasing the podcast and not giving up. And once you hit a certain level of momentum, you're going to see that your audience actually starts to grow faster and faster. There are other things that you can do. And by the way, there is a free PDF you can download. It's called the 7-Day Podcast Launch Blueprint, where I go into more detail about what you can do and what you need to do. Everything we talked about here, but in more detail. And you can download it for free. The link is in the description. That goes into more detail and will help you exactly understand what you need to do in more detail to launch your podcast. So if you'd like to launch your podcast even faster, download that 7-Day Podcast Launch Blueprint. It will save you hours upon hours of research, of doing it on your own or trying to figure it out. So what I want to leave you with is this. Your podcast doesn't have to be complicated or perfect to be worth doing or to be worth releasing. It can be a tremendous asset to your business if you just focus on releasing it rather than thinking about the complexities that most people, most gurus will tell you to do. And you can always improve your podcast later. So focus on releasing what you have now, and you can always improve later. And if this has been helpful to you, subscribe to the channel for more simple tips on podcasting. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next video. Bye.